The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her rifle scope for the 100th time that day. At 19, she was the only woman among 43 recruits at the elite sniper training facility in Virginia. The other trainees had stopped staring weeks ago, but the instructors still watched her with skeptical eyes, waiting for her to crack under pressure. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Montana where hunting wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke about his service, had taught her to shoot when she was 8 years old. By 12, she could hit a moving target at 300 yards. By 16, she was outshotting grown men at local competitions. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, lying prone on the unforgiving ground, knowing that her next shot would determine whether she stayed or went home. The target stood 800 yards away, a standard silhouette that seemed impossibly small through her scope. Around her, she could hear the steady breathing of her fellow trainees, each one fighting their own battle with wind, distance, and doubt. The instructor's voice crackled through their earpieces, calm and methodical as always. Wind is coming from the southeast at 8 miles per hour. Temperature is 72 degrees. Humidity at 60%. You have one shot to qualify for the advanced program. Miss, and you're back to regular infantry. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about her younger brother Jake, who had enlisted in the army 6 months before her. She thought about her mother, who had cried when Sarah announced she was joining the military instead of going to college. Most of all, she thought about her father's words on the day she left for basic training. "You're tougher than you know, kiddo," he had said, his weathered hands resting on her shoulders. But being tough isn't enough out there. You need to be smart, patient, and willing to do what others won't. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and never let them see you doubt yourself. Opening her eyes, Sarah settled back into position. Through her scope, she could see the heat shimmer rising from the ground between her and the target. She calculated the wind drift, adjusted for the slight upward angle, and controlled her breathing just as she had been taught. Her finger found the trigger, applying steady pressure until the rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. The target dropped instantly, a perfect center mass hit that drew approving nods from the instructors. Around her, other rifles continued to fire, but Sarah's attention was already shifting to the next challenge. She had qualified for advanced training, but she knew this was just the beginning of a journey that would test every fiber of her being. 3 days later, Sarah found herself in a classified briefing room with only 12 other trainees. The mortality rate for advanced sniper training was high not because trainees died, but because the physical and psychological demands broke most people before they could graduate. The instructor, a grizzled sergeant named Rodriguez, had a reputation for being both brilliant and merciless. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of combat experience, "you've proven you can shoot. Now we're going to find out if you can think, adapt, and survive. Over the next 6 months, you'll learn skills that most people pray they never need to use. You'll learn to become invisible, to strike without warning, and to live with the consequences of your actions." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Some of you are here because you're good shots. Some are here because you scored high on psychological evaluations. And some," his eyes briefly met Sarah's, "are here because someone wants to prove a point. I don't care why you're here. I only care whether you can do the job when lives are on the line." The training that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Days began at 4 in the morning with physical conditioning that pushed her body to its limits. She learned to low crawl through mud and brush for hours without detection, to estimate ranges by eye alone, and to remain motionless for entire days while observing targets. But the most challenging part wasn't physical, it was psychological. "A sniper's greatest weapon isn't the rifle," Rodriguez explained during one of their evening classes. "It's the mind. You need to think like your enemy, anticipate their movements, and understand their weaknesses. But you also need to maintain your humanity while doing things that would destroy most people's souls. Sarah absorbed every lesson with fierce determination. She studied ballistics tables until she could recite them from memory. She practiced camouflage techniques until she could disappear into any environment. She learned to read weather patterns, understand urban warfare tactics, and operate communication equipment that most soldiers would never see. But, perhaps most importantly, she learned to manage the mental burden that came with her chosen profession. During the 4th month of training, the instructors introduced psychological evaluation exercises designed to test each trainee's ability to handle the stress of actual combat. Sarah found herself in a realistic urban environment, tasked with identifying and eliminating specific targets while protecting civilians. The scenarios were brutal and complex, designed to create moral dilemmas that had no clean answers. In one exercise, Sarah was positioned on a rooftop overlooking a crowded marketplace. Her target was a known terrorist leader, but he was using children as human shields. She had to wait for nearly 6 hours, fighting fatigue and doubt, before the perfect shot presented itself, a brief window when the target moved away from the children to speak with an associate. The shot was successful, but the psychological aftermath was devastating. Even though she knew it was just a training exercise, Sarah found herself questioning whether she had the emotional strength to take a real human life. That night, she called her father from a secure phone, struggling to find words for what she was feeling. "Dad, I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her father was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Sarah, when I was in Vietnam, I had to do things that still keep me awake at night. But I also saved lives by doing those things. The question isn't whether you can pull the trigger, it's whether you can live with the consequences while still being the person we raised you to be." His words helped, but Sarah knew that the real test was still ahead of her. The final phase of training would take place in a combat zone, where the targets would be real and the consequences permanent. She had 6 weeks to prepare herself mentally and emotionally for that reality. During those final weeks of training, Sarah formed unlikely friendships with several of her fellow trainees. There was Marcus, a former gang member from Detroit who had joined the army to escape a life of violence. There was Chen, a quiet intellectual from California who could calculate complex ballistic equations in his head. And there was Thompson, a cocky kid from Texas who reminded everyone daily that his grandfather had been a sniper in World War II. Despite their different backgrounds, they bonded over shared struggles and mutual respect. They studied together, trained together, and supported each other through the darkest moments of their preparation. Sarah particularly appreciated their acceptance of her as an equal, something she hadn't experienced since leaving her small Montana hometown. The night before their final evaluation, the 4 of them sat on the barracks steps, sharing stories about their lives before the military. Marcus talked about watching his younger sister graduate from high school, something he had never done himself. Chen described his parents' reaction when he enlisted instead of pursuing his PhD in mathematics. Thompson, for once dropping his cocky facade, admitted that he was terrified of disappointing his grandfather's memory. When it was Sarah's turn, she found herself talking about her brother Jake, who was serving with an infantry unit somewhere in the Middle East. "He writes me letters," she said quietly. "Always joking around, trying to make me laugh. But I can read between the lines. He's seen things, done things that are changing him. I just hope that when I get over there, I can watch his back the way he's always watched mine." The final evaluation was conducted in a realistic combat environment that had been constructed to replicate conditions they might face overseas. Each trainee was given a different scenario, but all were designed to test their ability to operate independently under extreme stress. Sarah's scenario involved infiltrating an enemy compound to gather intelligence and eliminate a high-value target. She spent 2 days preparing her approach, studying satellite imagery and intelligence reports to understand the target's routine. The compound was heavily guarded, with multiple sentries and sophisticated surveillance equipment. Her only advantage was a narrow window each evening when the target emerged onto a balcony to use a satellite phone. On the night of the mission, Sarah positioned herself in a bombed-out building 600 yards from the compound. The shot itself would be challenging. She would be firing upward at an angle, through a small gap between buildings, with limited visibility. But the greater challenge would be infiltrating and exfiltrating without being detected by the numerous guards. She reached her position just after midnight, moving slowly and carefully through the rubble-strewn streets. Her ghillie suit, carefully customized with local vegetation and debris, made her nearly invisible in the urban environment. Once in position, she began the waiting game that every sniper knows well: hours of motionless observation, gathering intelligence while remaining undetected. At exactly 9:30, just as the intelligence reports had indicated, her target appeared on the balcony. Sarah had been holding her position for nearly 10 hours, fighting fatigue, thirst, and the natural human urge to move. Through her scope, she could see the target clearly: a middle-aged man in military fatigues, speaking animatedly into his phone while gesturing toward the street below. Sarah controlled her breathing, calculated the wind drift and bullet drop, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect, striking the target's center mass and dropping him instantly. But her mission wasn't complete. She still had to escape without being detected by the guards who were now flooding the compound in response to the attack. Using skills she had learned during months of training, Sarah began her withdrawal, moving slowly and methodically through the urban landscape. She could hear shouting and gunfire behind her as the guards searched for the shooter, but her careful route planning allowed her to avoid detection. It took her 3 hours to reach the extraction point, where her instructors were waiting with evaluations that would determine her future. Sergeant Rodriguez looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. Clean shot, Martinez. No detection during infiltration or exfiltration. Mission accomplished. He paused, studying her face carefully. How do you feel about what you just did? Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. Like I did what was necessary to complete the mission, Sergeant. Nothing more, nothing less. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Good answer. But, remember, in the real world, that target would have had a family, friends, people who cared about him. You can't let that reality destroy you, but you can't ignore it either. The moment you stop caring about the human cost of what we do is the moment you become something other than a soldier. 2 weeks later, Sarah graduated from the Advanced Sniper program with honors. She was one of only 5 trainees from her original class to successfully complete the course. The graduation ceremony was small and private, attended only by instructors and a few senior officers. There were no families present, no media coverage, and no public recognition. The nature of their training demanded secrecy. As Sarah received her graduation certificate and specialized equipment, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a small-town girl who hunted deer to help feed her family to one of the most highly trained soldiers in the world, she had transformed herself through determination, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. But she also knew that her real education was just beginning. Soon, she would be deployed to a combat zone where the targets would be real, the stakes life and death, and the margin for error non-existent. She thought about her brother Jake, somewhere overseas, and wondered if their paths would cross in the dangerous months ahead. That evening, as she packed her belongings for deployment, Sarah called her father one last time. I made it through, Dad. I'm officially a sniper now. Her father's pride was evident in his voice, but so was his concern. I'm proud of you, kiddo. Prouder than I know how to say. Just remember what I taught you about staying human in inhuman situations. The hardest part isn't learning to kill, it's learning to live with yourself afterward. As Sarah hung up the phone, she reflected on his words. Tomorrow, she would board a transport plane that would take her to a war zone where she would face challenges that no amount of training could fully prepare her for. She would have to prove herself not just as a sniper, but as a soldier, a woman, and a human being operating in circumstances that tested all three identities simultaneously. Looking out the barracks window at the star-filled sky, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would serve with honor, protect those who needed protection, and never lose sight of the values that had brought her this far. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it with the same determination that had carried her through the most challenging training program the military had to offer. The girl from Montana who had learned to hunt out of necessity was now a weapon in the hands of democracy, trained to protect freedoms that many people took for granted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to prove that her father's faith in her had been justified. But tonight, she was simply Sarah Martinez, a young woman who had achieved something remarkable and was preparing to test herself against the greatest challenges life could offer. The transport plane touched down at Forward Operating Base Apache just as the sun was setting over the Afghan mountains. Sarah stepped off the aircraft into air thick with dust and the smell of diesel fuel, her equipment bag slung over her shoulder and her rifle case in hand. After 18 months of training, she was finally in a combat zone, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming sensory assault of her first deployment. The base was a sprawling collection of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and razor wire, all designed to create a small piece of American territory in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Helicopters thundered overhead constantly, their rotor wash adding to the perpetual haze of dust that seemed to cover everything. Soldiers moved with purpose between buildings, their faces showing the weariness that came from months of combat operations. Sarah was met by Staff Sergeant Williams, a compact man in his 30s who would serve as her team leader. His uniform bore the patches and insignia of someone who had seen considerable combat, and his eyes held the alert wariness that marked experienced soldiers. He looked her up and down appraisingly, taking in her youth and gender with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Martinez, right," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Welcome to the sandbox. Hope you're ready to get your feet wet, because we've got a mission briefing in 30 minutes. As Williams led her through the base, he provided a rapid-fire orientation that covered everything from meal schedules to emergency procedures. Sarah tried to absorb it all while simultaneously taking in her new environment. The base was much larger than she had expected, housing nearly 3,000 soldiers from various units. Her sniper team was just one small part of a much larger operation designed to bring stability to a region that had known nothing but war for decades. "Your reputation preceded you," Williams said as they walked. "Word is you set some records back at the schoolhouse. That's good, because we're going to need every advantage we can get out here. The enemy knows we're here, they know how we operate, and they're constantly adapting their tactics to counter ours." They stopped outside a nondescript building that served as the team's operations center. Williams turned to face her, his expression serious. "I'm going to give you some advice, Martinez, and I want you to listen carefully. Everything you learned in training was important, but this is different. Out here, hesitation gets people killed. Second-guessing yourself gets people killed. And thinking you can save everyone gets people killed. Your job is to be the best sniper you can be and trust your team to do their jobs. Understood?" Sarah nodded, appreciating his directness. "Understood, Sergeant." The mission briefing took place in a room filled with maps, satellite imagery, and communication equipment. Sarah met the other members of her team: Corporal Jackson, a spotter with 6 years of experience, Private First Class Rodriguez, a communications specialist, and Sergeant First Class Thompson, the team's medic and explosive ordnance expert. Each man looked her over with professional interest, evaluating the new addition to their tight-knit unit. The briefing officer, Major Harrison, was a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent years making life-and-death decisions. He gestured to a large map of the surrounding region as he began the briefing. Intelligence indicates that a high-value target has been operating in this valley, he said, pointing to an area roughly 20 miles from the base. Ahmad Nazir, a Taliban commander responsible for organizing attacks against coalition forces throughout this province. He's been particularly effective at coordinating ambushes against our supply convoys. Harrison clicked a remote, and a photograph appeared on the screen behind him. It showed a bearded man in traditional Afghan clothing, his eyes hard and intelligent. Sarah studied the image carefully, memorizing every detail of the face she might soon see through her rifle scope. Nazir is cautious and intelligent, Harrison continued. He rarely stays in one location for more than a day or two, and he always travels with bodyguards. However, our intelligence assets have identified a pattern in his movements. He meets with local tribal leaders every 2 weeks at a compound in the village of Bagram. Our next opportunity to intercept him will be in 3 days. The mission plan was complex and dangerous. Sarah's team would be inserted by helicopter at a landing zone 5 miles from the target village. They would then move on foot through mountainous terrain to establish an overwatch position that provided clear fields of fire on the compound where Nazir was expected to meet with the tribal leaders. The shot distance will be approximately 800 meters, Major Harrison explained. The target will likely be exposed for only brief periods as he moves between vehicles and buildings. You'll have one opportunity to take the shot, and it needs to be perfect. Miss, and he disappears for another 6 months while our people continue dying in his ambushes. After the briefing, Sarah spent the next 2 days preparing for her first combat mission. She studied satellite imagery of the target area until she could visualize every building and terrain feature. She practiced shooting at various ranges and angles on the base's rifle range, adjusting for the altitude and atmospheric conditions of their operating environment. Most importantly, she worked with Corporal Jackson to develop the communication signals and teamwork that would be essential during the mission. Jackson was a professional soldier with extensive combat experience, but he had never worked with a female sniper before. Initially, he seemed skeptical of her abilities, testing her knowledge with rapid-fire questions about ballistics, weather effects, and tactical procedures. However, as he witnessed her competence and dedication, his attitude gradually shifted from skepticism to respect. "You know your stuff," he admitted during one of their practice sessions. "I've worked with snipers who had years of experience but couldn't calculate wind drift as fast as you can. Just remember that when we're out there, everything happens fast and nothing goes according to plan. Stay flexible and trust your instincts." The night before the mission, Sarah found it difficult to sleep. She lay on her narrow cot, listening to the distant sound of artillery and wondering what the next day would bring. She thought about her brother Jake, who was serving with an infantry unit somewhere in this same country, and hoped that he was safe. She thought about her parents back in Montana, who had no idea that their daughter was about to potentially take her first human life. Most of all, she thought about the target she would be hunting. Ahmad Nazir was not an abstract enemy, he was a real person with a family, beliefs, and reasons for fighting. The intelligence briefings had painted him as a dangerous terrorist, but Sarah knew that he probably saw himself as a patriot defending his homeland against foreign invaders. Understanding her enemy's perspective didn't change her mission, but it added a layer of moral complexity that her training hadn't fully prepared her for. At 4 a.m, Sarah and her team gathered at the helicopter landing pad for final equipment checks. Each team member carried specialized gear suited to their role. Sarah had her custom rifle, advanced optics, and enough ammunition for sustained operations. Jackson carried spotting equipment and range-finding devices. Rodriguez had communication gear that would keep them connected to base, and Thompson packed medical supplies and demolition equipment. The helicopter ride to the insertion point was Sarah's first experience flying in a combat zone. The pilot flew low and fast, following valleys and ridgelines to avoid potential surface-to-air missile threats. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the rugged beauty of the Afghan landscape, snow-capped peaks, deep valleys, and ancient villages that seemed unchanged by centuries of conflict. 2 minutes to landing zone, the pilot announced through their headsets. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the helicopter began its descent toward a flat area between two ridges. This was it, her first real mission, where the training would meet reality and lives would hang in the balance. The insertion went smoothly, with the helicopter touching down just long enough for the team to exit before lifting off and disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah found herself standing in a foreign landscape, surrounded by silence broken only by the distant sound of the departing aircraft. For a moment, the enormity of her situation overwhelmed her. She was 20 years old, thousands of miles from home, carrying a weapon designed to kill people she had never met. Williams quickly organized the team for movement toward their objective. They would travel primarily during darkness to avoid detection, covering the 5 miles to their overwatch position in a series of carefully planned movements. The terrain was challenging, steep slopes, loose rock, and limited visibility that made navigation difficult. As they moved through the darkness, Sarah became acutely aware of every sound and shadow around them. Her training had taught her to be observant, but the potential for enemy contact made every sense hyper-alert. She listened for the sound of footsteps on rock that might indicate an enemy patrol, watched for the glint of metal that might reveal a hidden position, and felt for changes in air movement that might suggest someone else's presence. The first day of movement passed without incident, but the physical demands were greater than Sarah had expected. The high altitude made breathing difficult, and the weight of her equipment seemed to increase with every step. By the time they reached their intermediate position, she was exhausted but determined not to show weakness to her teammates. "You're doing good," Jackson whispered during a brief rest stop. "A lot of new guys can't handle the altitude and the weight. You're keeping up better than some experienced soldiers I've worked with." His encouragement meant more to Sarah than she could express. Acceptance from her peers was something she had fought for throughout her military career, and earning it in a combat environment felt like a significant milestone. On the second night, as they approached their final overwatch position, the team encountered their first sign of enemy presence. Rodriguez, who was monitoring radio frequencies, detected communication traffic that suggested Taliban forces were active in the area. The team immediately increased their security measures, posting additional sentries and preparing contingency plans for potential contact. "Could be nothing," Williams whispered during a team conference. "But could also mean they know we're here. We proceed with the mission, but everyone stays extra alert." The overwatch position was a rocky outcropping that provided excellent visibility of the target compound while offering concealment for the team. Sarah spent hours studying the building through her scope, memorizing every detail and calculating various shooting scenarios. The compound consisted of several buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with multiple entry and exit points that the target might use. Target building is the largest structure on the north side of the compound, Jackson noted as he studied the area through his spotting scope. "Intelligence says the meetings usually take place on the second floor, but we need to be prepared for him to appear anywhere in the compound." As they waited for their target to arrive, Sarah experienced the peculiar combination of boredom and tension that characterized military operations. Hours passed with nothing happening, followed by brief periods of intense activity that demanded split-second decisions. She learned to manage her anxiety while maintaining the alert readiness necessary for instant action. On the morning of the third day, their patience was rewarded. Rodriguez intercepted communications indicating that Nasir's convoy was approaching the village. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she positioned herself behind her rifle, knowing that the moment she had trained for was finally at hand. Through her scope, she watched as 3 vehicles approached the compound. The lead and trailing vehicles contained armed guards, while the middle vehicle presumably carried their target. The convoy stopped outside the compound's main gate, and several figures emerged from the vehicles. "I count 8 individuals," Jackson reported quietly. Target identification is difficult from this distance, but the movement patterns suggest VIP security protocols. Sarah tracked the figures through her scope as they moved toward the compound entrance. One man, slightly older and more deliberate in his movements, seemed to be the focus of the security detail's attention. Based on the intelligence photographs she had studied, Sarah believed this was Ahmad Nazir. Possible target identification, she whispered to Jackson. Central figure, traditional dress, moving toward the main entrance. The target disappeared into the building, beginning what intelligence had indicated would be a meeting lasting several hours. Sarah and her team settled in for an extended observation period, knowing that their opportunity would come when Nazir emerged from the building to return to his convoy. The wait was excruciating. Sarah maintained her position behind the rifle, fighting fatigue and the natural tendency for muscles to cramp during extended periods of motionlessness. Around her, her teammates maintained their own watches, monitoring for threats and gathering intelligence that might prove useful for future operations. Finally, after nearly 4 hours, movement was detected at the compound entrance. Jackson confirmed through his spotting scope that several individuals were emerging from the building, including the man they believed to be their target. Target is moving toward the vehicle, Jackson reported. Range is 830 meters. Wind is negligible. You have a clear shot. Sarah settled into her final firing position, controlling her breathing and focusing on the crosshairs in her scope. Through the magnified optics, she could see her target clearly, a middle-aged man walking purposefully toward the waiting convoy. For a moment, she saw him not as an enemy combatant but as a human being, possibly a father and husband, someone with hopes and fears just like anyone else. Then, she remembered the intelligence briefings about the soldiers who had died in attacks organized by this man. She thought about her brother Jake and the thousands of other young men and women serving in harm's way. Her finger moved to the trigger as she made the final calculations for wind and distance. You have the shot, Jackson confirmed quietly. Sarah squeezed the trigger with steady pressure, just as she had done thousands of times in training. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley, and, through her scope, she saw her target fall immediately. There was no dramatic slow-motion moment, no philosophical contemplation, just the mechanical execution of a precisely planned military operation. Target down, she reported, already beginning to scan for threats as the compound erupted into chaos below. The security detail was reacting exactly as their training had predicted, seeking cover and attempting to locate the source of the gunfire. Sarah and her team had perhaps 10 minutes before enemy forces would begin moving to surround their position. Excellent shot, Williams said as he organized the team for withdrawal. Now let's get out of here before they find us. The extraction was more challenging than the insertion had been. Enemy forces were now actively searching for them, and the team had to move quickly while avoiding detection. Sarah discovered that moving under pressure was far more difficult than the controlled training exercises she had experienced. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier, and every sound might indicate that their position had been compromised. They moved for 12 hours through increasingly difficult terrain, finally, reaching an extraction point where a helicopter waited to return them to base. As Sarah climbed aboard the aircraft, she reflected on what she had just experienced. In a matter of seconds, she had ended a human life from nearly half a mile away. The technical aspects of the shot had been exactly as she had trained for, but the emotional impact was something no amount of preparation could have anticipated. Back at the base, the team was debriefed by intelligence officers who confirmed that their target had been eliminated. Ahmad Nazir was dead, and his network of attacks against coalition forces would be significantly disrupted. From a tactical standpoint, the mission had been a complete success. But, for Sarah, the success felt hollow. She had proven that she could perform under pressure and execute the mission she had trained for. However, she had also crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer a soldier who might someday have to kill, she was a soldier who had killed. The distinction was subtle but profound, marking a transformation that would affect every aspect of her remaining military service. That night, as she lay on her cot listening to the familiar sounds of the base, Sarah thought about calling her father. She wanted to hear his voice and, perhaps, find some wisdom that would help her process what she had experienced. But, she realized that some experiences were too personal and too complex to share, even with someone who had faced similar challenges in his own military service. Instead, she wrote a letter to her brother Jake, carefully avoiding any details that might be classified but trying to convey something of what she was experiencing. She told him about the landscape, the people she was working with, and the strange combination of boredom and terror that characterized military operations. Most importantly, she told him that she understood now why he had seemed different in his recent letters home. War changed people in ways that were difficult to describe to those who hadn't experienced it. Sarah was beginning to understand that her journey as a sniper would involve not just technical proficiency but also a constant struggle to maintain her humanity while performing duties that required her to end human lives. The girl from Montana was still there, but she was now sharing space with something harder and more complex, a professional soldier who had proven herself capable of killing when necessary. As she sealed the letter to her brother, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would continue to serve with honor and professionalism, but she would never allow the necessity of her duties to make her callous or indifferent to the human cost of war. Each mission would be executed with precision and dedication, but each life taken would be remembered and acknowledged as the profound responsibility it represented. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove herself. But tonight, she was simply Sarah Martinez, a young woman who had faced her first real test as a soldier and emerged changed but determined to continue serving with integrity and purpose. 3 months after her first confirmed kill, Sarah had become something of a legend within the special operations community. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit world of military snipers, and her reputation for precision shooting under extreme conditions had earned her respect from soldiers who typically viewed newcomers with skepticism. She had completed 12 successful missions, each one adding to her growing reputation as one of the most effective snipers in the theater of operations. But recognition came with a price. Sarah found herself constantly under scrutiny from superior officers who wanted to understand what made her so effective, media personnel seeking stories about women in combat, and fellow soldiers who either resented her success or sought to ride on her coattails. The simple clarity of her early training had been replaced by a complex web of expectations, politics, and pressures that threatened to overshadow her primary mission. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Sarah was cleaning her rifle in the team's equipment bay when Staff Sergeant Williams approached with a classified message folder. His expression was more serious than usual, and she could tell immediately that something significant was about to happen. "Martinez, you've been requested for a special assignment," he said, handing her the folder. "Can't give you details here, but you need to report to Colonel Bradford's office at 1400 hours. Dress uniform." Sarah's heart sank. In her experience, dress uniform meetings rarely led to anything good for enlisted soldiers. She spent the rest of the morning wondering what she had done wrong or what impossible mission she was about to be assigned. The speculation was driving her crazy, but military discipline prevented her from asking the questions that burned in her mind. Colonel Bradford was the base commander, a career officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for both brilliance and demanding perfection from his subordinates. Sarah had never met him personally, though she had seen him during base ceremonies and briefings. As she stood at attention outside his office, she tried to imagine what he might want with a 20-year-old sniper. "Enter," came the command from inside the office. Sarah stepped into a room that reflected the colonel's professional military bearing. The walls were covered with commendations, unit citations, and photographs from various deployments spanning 3 decades. Behind a large desk sat Colonel Bradford himself, a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire room despite his relatively modest physical stature. "At ease, Sergeant Martinez," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit down." As Sarah settled into the chair, she noticed that they were not alone. In the corner of the office stood a man in civilian clothes whose bearing and alertness marked him as someone with military or intelligence background. He was introduced as Mr. Johnson, though Sarah suspected that was not his real name. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Bradford began, "your performance over the past several months has been exceptional. 12 confirmed kills, 0 misses, and completion of every assigned mission with distinction. More importantly, you've demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking and adaptability that we value in our most elite units." He paused to study a file on his desk before continuing. "Mr. Johnson represents a joint task force that specializes in high-priority target elimination. They've requested your services for a mission that could significantly impact the course of operations in this region." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. Recognition for her abilities was gratifying, but she had learned that special assignments often came with extraordinary risks and complications. She waited for Colonel Bradford to continue, maintaining the professional composure that had become second nature during her military service. "The target is Hassan al-Rashid, a foreign fighter who has been training local insurgents in advanced explosive techniques," Mr. Johnson said, speaking for the first time. "His bombs have killed over 200 coalition soldiers in the past 6 months, and intelligence indicates that he's preparing to share even more sophisticated techniques with Taliban forces." Johnson activated a laptop and projected an image onto the wall screen. The photograph showed a man in his 40s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Unlike the local fighters Sarah had encountered, this target looked educated and sophisticated, someone who had chosen terrorism as a career rather than being driven to it by circumstance. "Al-Rashid is extremely cautious," Johnson continued. "He never stays in one location for more than a few days, and he's surrounded by bodyguards who are trained by foreign intelligence services. Previous attempts to eliminate him have failed because conventional approaches lack the precision and stealth necessary to penetrate his security." The mission parameters were unlike anything Sarah had encountered. Al-Rashid would be attending a meeting in a compound located deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces and sophisticated security measures. The shot distance would exceed 1,000 meters, requiring her to operate at the very limits of her equipment's capability. Most challenging of all, she would be working alone, without the support team that had backed her up on previous missions. "Why me?" Sarah asked, knowing that there were snipers with more experience who might be better suited for such a challenging assignment. Colonel Bradford and Mr. Johnson exchanged glances before Bradford answered. "Because you've demonstrated the ability to think independently and adapt to unexpected circumstances. This mission will require improvisation and decision-making that goes beyond following predetermined plans." He leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more intense. "But there's another factor, Sergeant. Intelligence suggests that Al-Rashid specifically recruits female operatives because he believes they're underestimated by coalition forces. We want to send a message that there are no safe assumptions in this war." Over the next week, Sarah prepared for the mission with an intensity that exceeded even her initial sniper training. She studied satellite imagery of the target area until she could navigate it blindfolded. She practiced shooting at extended ranges under various weather conditions, pushing her equipment and skills to their absolute limits. Most importantly, she developed contingency plans for every scenario she could imagine, knowing that her survival would depend on her ability to adapt when things went wrong. The psychological preparation was as important as the technical training. Sarah spent hours visualizing the mission, mentally rehearsing each phase of the operation until it became automatic. She studied everything available about her target, learning his habits, preferences, and psychological profile. The more she learned, the more she realized that this was not just another insurgent leader but a sophisticated enemy who had dedicated his life to killing American soldiers. 2 days before the mission, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Her brother Jake had managed to arrange leave from his infantry unit and had driven across the country to see her. The reunion was emotional for both siblings, though they had to be careful about what they discussed due to operational security requirements. "You look different," Jake observed as they sat in the base's recreation center, sharing coffee and catching up on family news. "Harder, somehow. More focused." Sarah considered his observation carefully. "I guess I've seen things that changed me. Done things that changed me. But I'm still the same person underneath." Jake studied her face, seeing something in her eyes that hadn't been there before their deployments. "Mom and Dad worry about you, you know. Dad doesn't say much, but I can tell he's proud and terrified at the same time." They talked for hours about their experiences, carefully avoiding classified details while sharing the emotional impact of their military service. Jake told her about losing friends in IED attacks and the difficulty of maintaining morale when victories seemed impossible to define. Sarah described the isolation of her role and the weight of responsibility that came with being a precision marksman. "Do you ever regret enlisting?" Jake asked as their time together drew to a close. Sarah thought about the question seriously before answering. "No. What we're doing here matters, even when it's hard to see how. Every mission I complete successfully means fewer American soldiers die in terrorist attacks. That's worth whatever personal cost I have to pay." The night before her departure, Sarah called her parents from a secure phone. The conversation was brief and carefully worded, but she wanted to hear their voices before embarking on her most dangerous mission. Her mother's concern was evident even through the static-filled connection, while her father's pride came through in his few words of encouragement. "Be careful out there, kiddo," he said as the call ended. "Come home safe." The insertion for the Al-Rashid mission was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Instead of helicopter transport, she was taken to the target area by a small special operations unit that specialized in deep reconnaissance. The team moved on foot through hostile territory for 3 days, avoiding enemy patrols and surveillance while gradually approaching the target location. Sarah's role in the insertion phase was purely as a passenger, allowing the specialists to handle navigation and security while she conserved her energy for the mission ahead. She used the time to observe their techniques and study the terrain they would be operating in, gathering intelligence that might prove useful during her solo operation. The target compound was located in a valley surrounded by steep ridges, providing natural security but also limiting escape routes. Intelligence indicated that Al-Rashid would arrive for a meeting with local commanders on the 3rd day, staying only long enough to transfer money and equipment before departing for his next location. Sarah's shooting position would be on a ridge overlooking the valley, approximately 1,200 meters from the target building. The distance was at the very edge of her rifle's effective range, requiring perfect conditions and flawless execution to achieve a successful hit. She would have one opportunity to take the shot before enemy forces converged on her position. The Special Operations team left her at a predetermined point roughly 2 miles from her objective, wishing her luck before disappearing into the darkness. For the first time in her military career, Sarah was completely alone in enemy territory, carrying only the equipment she could manage by herself and depending entirely on her own skills for survival. The movement to her shooting position took most of the night, as Sarah had to navigate difficult terrain while avoiding detection by enemy sentries. She used every stealth technique she had learned, moving slowly and carefully through areas where a single misplaced step could trigger an avalanche of loose rock that would reveal her presence. By dawn, she had reached her designated position and began preparing for the long wait ahead. Her shooting position was a small depression between large boulders that provided concealment while offering a clear view of the target compound. She arranged her equipment carefully, ensuring that everything she needed was within easy reach while maintaining the low profile necessary to avoid detection. Through her scope, Sarah could see the compound clearly despite the extreme distance. The building where the meeting would take place was a two-story structure with a flat roof, surrounded by smaller buildings and defensive positions. She counted at least 20 guards visible around the perimeter, with undoubtedly more inside the buildings. As the day progressed, activity around the compound increased. Vehicles arrived carrying what appeared to be local Taliban commanders, while additional security personnel took positions around the meeting site. Sarah remained motionless in her position, fighting off fatigue and maintaining constant observation of her target area. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, a convoy of 3 vehicles approached the compound from the north. Through her scope, Sarah watched as several figures emerged from the vehicles, including one man whose appearance matched intelligence photographs of al-Rashid. Her heart rate increased as she realized that her target had arrived and the critical phase of her mission was beginning. The target remained visible for only a few minutes before disappearing into the building where the meeting would take place. Sarah settled in for what could be a lengthy wait, knowing that her opportunity would come when al-Rashid emerged to return to his convoy. She used the time to make final adjustments to her scope, account for atmospheric conditions, and mentally rehearse the shot sequence. After nearly 4 hours, movement was detected at the compound entrance. Sarah watched through her scope as several figures emerged from the building, but, at the extreme range, positive identification was difficult. She waited patiently, knowing that hasty action could result in missing her only opportunity to complete the mission. Then, she saw him clearly. Al-Rashid emerged from the building and began walking toward his waiting convoy. The distance was 1,247 meters according to her rangefinder, and wind conditions were challenging but manageable. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds before her target would reach his vehicle and disappear, possibly forever. She settled into her final firing position, controlling her breathing and focusing on the crosshairs in her scope. This shot would require every skill she had developed during years of training and months of combat experience. There was no margin for error. Either she would eliminate one of the most dangerous terrorist leaders in the region, or she would alert him to the threat and lose any chance of future success. Sarah squeezed the trigger with the same steady pressure she had used hundreds of times before, but this time the stakes were higher than they had ever been. The bullet's flight time at that distance was nearly 2 seconds, an eternity during which anything could go wrong. She watched through her scope as her target continued walking, unaware that death was racing toward him at 3 times the speed of sound. The impact was immediate and definitive. Al-Rashid collapsed instantly, struck by a bullet that had traveled nearly 3/4 of a mile to reach its target. The compound immediately erupted into chaos as security personnel sought cover and began scanning for the source of the attack. Sarah allowed herself one moment of satisfaction before beginning the most dangerous phase of her mission: escape and evasion through hostile territory while enemy forces attempted to locate and eliminate her. She quickly gathered her equipment and began moving away from her shooting position, knowing that she had perhaps 15 minutes before the area would be swarming with searchers. The extraction was a nightmare of close calls and near misses. Enemy forces had responded faster than intelligence had predicted, and Sarah found herself trapped in a series of valleys where helicopter searches made movement during daylight impossible. She spent 2 days hiding in caves and moving only during darkness, living on emergency rations and trying to reach a pickup point where friendly forces could extract her. On the 3rd night, exhausted and running low on water, Sarah finally reached the designated extraction zone. A special operations helicopter was waiting, its crew scanning the area for threats while she stumbled toward the aircraft. As the helicopter lifted off and headed toward friendly territory, Sarah allowed herself to relax for the first time since beginning the mission. The debriefing that followed confirmed what Sarah already knew: her mission had been a complete success. Al-Rashid was dead, and intelligence indicated that his bomb-making network was already beginning to fragment without his leadership. From a strategic standpoint, the mission would save dozens if not hundreds of coalition lives. But, for Sarah, the personal cost was becoming increasingly evident. Each successful mission added to her reputation and led to more dangerous assignments. She was becoming trapped in a cycle where her success made her increasingly valuable to planners who saw her as a unique asset rather than a human being with limitations and needs. A week after her return from the Al-Rashid mission, Sarah received orders that would change her life again. She was being transferred to an even more specialized unit, one that operated with minimal oversight and took on missions that conventional forces couldn't handle. The transfer was presented as an honor and a recognition of her unique abilities. As she packed her belongings for yet another move, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since leaving her small Montana hometown. She had become one of the most feared snipers in the military, someone whose reputation preceded her wherever she went. But she had also become isolated from normal human relationships and trapped in a role that demanded constant perfection. The girl who had learned to hunt deer to help feed her family had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Sarah Martinez was now a weapon in the hands of military planners, but she was determined to remain a human being despite the pressures that threatened to strip away her humanity. The journey ahead would test that determination in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The classified facility where Sarah reported for her new assignment looked nothing like a traditional military base. Hidden in the mountains of Virginia, it resembled more a corporate retreat than a training center for the military's most elite operators. The buildings were modern and discreet, surrounded by forests that provided natural concealment from satellite surveillance. Even the guards at the entrance wore civilian clothes, though their bearing and alertness clearly marked them as highly trained military personnel. Sarah's new commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Stone, a woman in her early 40s who had spent 15 years in special operations before taking command of this unique unit. Stone had a reputation for brilliance and absolute dedication to mission success, but she also understood the psychological challenges faced by soldiers who operated in the shadowy world of classified operations. "Welcome to Task Force Phantom," Stone said as she led Sarah through the facility during her initial orientation. "We don't exist on any official organizational chart, and our missions are so classified that most generals don't know what we do. Our job is to eliminate threats that conventional forces can't touch and to operate in environments where failure means more than just mission failure, it means strategic disaster." The other members of Task Force Phantom were unlike any soldiers Sarah had encountered. There was Master Sergeant Chen, a former Delta Force operator who specialized in intelligence gathering and surveillance. Captain Rodriguez was an explosives expert who had spent 5 years working with CIA paramilitary units. Staff Sergeant Williams was a communications specialist who could establish secure links anywhere in the world. And Sergeant First Class Jackson was a medic whose skills had been honed during years of treating casualties in the most dangerous parts of the world. What made the unit unique wasn't just the individual skills of its members, but their ability to operate independently for extended periods in hostile territory. Unlike conventional military units that relied on extensive support structures, Task Force Phantom was designed to be completely self-sufficient, capable of sustaining operations for weeks or months without outside assistance. "Your role here will be different from what you're used to," Colonel Stone explained during Sarah's first mission briefing. "You won't just be a sniper, you'll be a complete operator capable of reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and independent decision-making in situations where communication with headquarters is impossible." The training that followed was the most intensive Sarah had ever experienced. She learned advanced surveillance techniques, including how to blend into urban and rural environments in various countries around the world. She studied foreign languages and cultural practices, developing the ability to operate effectively in societies completely different from her own. Most importantly, she learned to think strategically rather than just tactically, understanding how her actions would affect larger political and military objectives. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of her training was learning to operate completely alone for extended periods. While her previous missions had been conducted with team support, her new role would often require her to spend weeks in isolation, gathering intelligence and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The psychological demands of such isolation were enormous, requiring mental discipline that few people possessed. 6 months into her training with Task Force Phantom, Sarah received her first solo deep penetration mission. The target was a nuclear scientist who had been selling technology to terrorist organizations, operating from a heavily guarded compound in a country where American military presence was officially non-existent. The mission would require her to infiltrate the country using false documentation, establish surveillance of the target, and eliminate him when the opportunity presented itself. "This is not just about marksmanship," Colonel Stone emphasized during the final briefing. "You'll be operating without backup, without official support, and without any safety net if things go wrong. If you're captured, the government will deny any knowledge of your existence. Success depends entirely on your ability to blend in, gather intelligence, and execute the mission without detection." Sarah spent 2 weeks preparing for the mission, memorizing every detail of her cover identity and studying the target's habits and security arrangements. She would enter the country as a freelance journalist researching environmental issues, a cover that would allow her to move freely while carrying the specialized equipment she would need for surveillance and target elimination. The infiltration itself was nerve-wracking. Sarah found herself standing in an airport security line, knowing that discovery would mean imprisonment or death in a country that had no diplomatic relations with the United States. Her false documentation was perfect, created by specialists who had spent years developing covers for deep cover operatives, but the psychological pressure of maintaining her false identity was enormous. Once in country, Sarah established herself in a small hotel near the target's compound, using her cover as a journalist to explain her presence in the area. She spent days photographing local environmental conditions and interviewing residents, building credibility for her cover story while conducting discreet surveillance of her target's daily routine. The target, Dr. Alexander Petrov, was a former Soviet nuclear scientist who had become a mercenary after the collapse of the USSR. He lived in a compound that was part laboratory and part fortress, surrounded by security guards and sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. His daily routine was carefully planned to minimize exposure, but Sarah gradually identified patterns that could provide opportunities for a successful elimination. The challenge was that Petrov rarely exposed himself for more than a few seconds at a time, and always in locations where a long-distance shot would be extremely difficult. Sarah realized that she would need to get much closer than she had ever operated before, requiring infiltration of the compound's security perimeter. After 2 weeks of observation, Sarah identified her opportunity. Petrov had a habit of walking in a small garden behind his laboratory building each evening, apparently for exercise and relaxation. The garden was surrounded by a high wall, but Sarah discovered a position in an adjacent building that would provide a clear shot at a distance of approximately 300 meters. The building she needed to access was an abandoned factory that had been closed for several years. Getting inside required skills she had never used before: lockpicking, alarm system bypassing, and movement through structures that could collapse without warning. Sarah spent 3 days studying the building and planning her approach, knowing that a single mistake could expose her mission and lead to diplomatic crisis. On the night of the operation, Sarah approached the abandoned factory with equipment carefully concealed in a backpack designed to look like standard photography gear. She had one opportunity to complete the mission. Intelligence indicated that Petrov would be leaving the country within 48 hours, possibly never to return. The infiltration of the building went smoothly, with Sarah's training in urban operations allowing her to bypass security measures and reach her chosen firing position without detection. Through her scope, she could see the garden where Petrov would appear, but she had to wait for nearly 4 hours before he emerged from the laboratory building. When her target finally appeared, Sarah was ready. Petrov walked slowly through the garden, apparently lost in thought as he followed a predetermined path among the plants and trees. Sarah controlled her breathing and calculated the effects of wind and humidity on her bullet's trajectory. The shot would be technically challenging but, well within her capabilities. She squeezed the trigger with the same steady pressure she had used dozens of times before, and watched through her scope as Dr. Alexander Petrov collapsed among the roses he had been tending. The nuclear technology he had been selling to terrorists would no longer threaten American lives, and the network he had built would gradually collapse without his expertise. But the mission wasn't complete with the target's elimination. Sarah still had to escape the country without detection, a process that would test every skill she had developed during her months of training. The compound would soon be swarming with security personnel, and authorities would be searching for anyone who could have made the shot from such a distance. Sarah's escape route had been planned as carefully as the assassination itself. She exited the abandoned building using a different route than she had used for entry, then moved through the city using predetermined paths that avoided areas with heavy surveillance. Her cover as a journalist provided explanation for her presence in the area, but she knew that any detailed investigation would eventually expose her true identity. The most dangerous part of her extraction was the airport security check as she prepared to leave the country. Sarah maintained her cover identity perfectly, engaging in casual conversation with other passengers while her heart raced with the knowledge that discovery could mean life imprisonment. When the aircraft finally lifted off and entered international airspace, she allowed herself to relax for the first time in weeks. The mission debriefing back at Task Force Phantom revealed the strategic importance of her successful operation. Dr. Petrov's death had disrupted a network that intelligence analysts estimated could have provided nuclear technology to terrorist organizations within 6 months. Sarah's precise execution under extreme pressure had prevented a potential catastrophe that could have claimed thousands of lives. But the psychological cost of operating alone for extended periods was beginning to affect Sarah in ways she hadn't anticipated. The isolation required for deep cover operations was creating a distance between her and normal human relationships that threatened to become permanent. She found herself analyzing everyone she met for potential threats, unable to relax even when she was safely back in the United States. Colonel Stone recognized the signs and arranged for Sarah to undergo specialized counseling designed to help deep cover operatives maintain their psychological health. The sessions were conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a psychologist who had worked with intelligence operatives for over 20 years and understood the unique challenges they faced. "What you're experiencing is normal for someone in your position," Dr. Harper explained during one of their sessions. "The skills that keep you alive in hostile environments can become barriers to normal relationships when you're back home. We need to work on maintaining your operational effectiveness while preserving your ability to connect with other people." The counseling sessions helped Sarah understand that the psychological changes she was experiencing were part of the price of her chosen profession. But Dr. Harper also taught her techniques for managing the isolation and paranoia that came with deep cover work, helping her maintain connections to the person she had been before joining the military. Between missions, Sarah began making an effort to maintain relationships with family and friends back home. She called her parents regularly, carefully avoiding any details about her actual assignments while sharing enough about her life to maintain their connection. She also started a correspondence with her brother Jake, who was completing his own deployment and struggling with similar challenges of readjustment to civilian life. But the demands of her position with Task Force Phantom continued to escalate. Sarah's success on her first solo mission had established her reputation within the intelligence community, and requests for her services were coming from agencies and departments she had never heard of. Each mission was more challenging and dangerous than the last, requiring her to operate in environments where a single mistake could trigger international incidents. Her third solo mission took her to Southeast Asia, where she was tasked with eliminating a human trafficking leader whose organization was kidnapping American citizens for sale to terrorist groups. The target operated from a compound in a remote jungle area, protected by a private army of former military personnel from various countries. The mission required Sarah to infiltrate through dense jungle terrain, establish surveillance of a heavily defended position, and eliminate her target without triggering a firefight that could endanger captured Americans being held in the compound. She spent 3 weeks moving through hostile territory, avoiding patrols and gathering intelligence while suffering from tropical diseases and extreme environmental conditions. When she finally achieved her objective, eliminating the trafficking leader with a single precisely placed shot, Sarah had to exfiltrate through 40 miles of jungle while enemy forces searched for her. The extraction took 5 days and nearly cost her life when she was forced to hide underwater in a crocodile-infested river while a patrol passed overhead. Each successful mission added to Sarah's legend within the special operations community, but it also increased the isolation that threatened to consume her humanity. She was becoming a ghost, someone who existed primarily in classified files and whispered conversations among intelligence officials who needed someone eliminated without official involvement. The recognition of her abilities reached its peak when she was summoned to Washington for a meeting with officials whose names she wasn't allowed to know. The meeting took place in a nondescript office building, where men in expensive suits discussed missions that would affect the balance of power between nations. Sergeant Martinez, one of the officials said, "Your success rate is unprecedented in the history of special operations. You've eliminated threats that conventional military action couldn't touch, and you've done so without creating the diplomatic complications that would result from official military action." The meeting was both a commendation and a warning. Sarah's value as an asset had grown to the point where she was considered irreplaceable, but that value also made her a target for enemy intelligence services that had begun to investigate the mysterious operator behind several high-profile eliminations. "We're increasing your security clearance and expanding your mission parameters," another official explained. "But we're also implementing new protocols to protect your identity and ensure your continued effectiveness. From this point forward, you'll be operating under even deeper cover, with even less official support." As Sarah left the meeting, she reflected on how far she had traveled from the small-town girl who had learned to hunt deer in the Montana mountains. She had become one of the most lethal weapons in the American arsenal, capable of eliminating threats anywhere in the world with surgical precision. But she had also become something less recognizably human, shaped by years of violence and isolation into a tool for purposes she was only beginning to understand. The journey that had started with her desire to serve her country had led her into a shadowy world where moral certainties were rare and the consequences of failure could affect millions of lives. Sarah Martinez was no longer just a soldier, she had become a force of nature, as inevitable and impartial as death itself. And, somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered whether the person she had once been could ever find her way home from the darkness she now inhabited professionally. The next phase of her evolution was about to begin, and it would test not just her skills as an operator, but her ability to maintain her humanity while wielding power that few people could imagine. The girl from Montana was still there, buried deep beneath layers of training and experience, but she was becoming harder to find with each mission that pushed Sarah further from the world of normal human relationships and deeper into the realm of professional violence. As she prepared for her next assignment, Sarah made a promise to herself that she would remember who she had been before the military had shaped her into its perfect weapon. Somehow, she had to find a way to be both the operator that her country needed and the human being that her soul demanded she remain. The challenge would define the rest of her career and determine whether she could ever truly come home from the war that had become her life. The mission briefing that would ultimately define Sarah's legacy began like any other. She sat in the secure conference room at Task Force Phantom headquarters, studying satellite imagery and intelligence reports while Colonel Stone outlined the parameters of her most challenging assignment yet. But, this time, something was different. This time, the stakes reached beyond individual targets to the very foundation of American military operations in the region. "The target is General Hassan Qadri," Colonel Stone began, activating the room's secure projection system. "He's the architect of a new insurgent strategy that's causing massive casualties among coalition forces. But, more than that, he's preparing to execute an operation that could destroy the peace negotiations that have taken 2 years to develop." The intelligence briefing revealed the scope of Kadri's threat. Unlike the individual terrorists and weapons dealers Sarah had eliminated in previous missions, this target commanded an army of fighters and possessed the strategic vision to coordinate attacks across multiple countries. His planned operation would involve simultaneous strikes against diplomatic facilities in 3 different nations, potentially killing hundreds of civilians and derailing the fragile peace process. The challenge, Colonel Stone continued, is that Kadri will be attending a peace summit in neutral territory. Officially, he'll be under the protection of international law as a participant in diplomatic negotiations. Any action against him must appear to be the work of rival insurgent factions, not American operatives. Sarah studied the target's photograph with professional interest. General Kadri was younger than most of his predecessors, probably in his late 30s, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Unlike the criminals and terrorists she had eliminated before, this target would be surrounded by sophisticated security and operating in an environment where dozens of international observers would be present. The mission would require Sarah to infiltrate the summit location, a resort complex in the mountains of a neutral country, posing as a member of the international media. She would have to maintain her cover while conducting surveillance, identify a window of opportunity to eliminate the target, and execute the mission without triggering an international incident that could destroy American diplomatic efforts throughout the region. The shot distance will be extreme, the intelligence briefer noted, possibly over 1,500 meters, depending on the target's location and your available positions. Weather conditions will be challenging, and you'll have only one opportunity before security protocols make any further attempts impossible. Sarah spent the next month preparing for what everyone understood would be the most important mission of her career. She studied the target location until she could navigate it blindfolded, memorized the schedules and security arrangements for the summit, and developed multiple contingency plans for various scenarios. Most importantly, she practiced shooting at extreme distances under adverse conditions, pushing her equipment and skills to their absolute limits. The psychological preparation was equally intensive. Dr. Harper worked with Sarah to ensure she could maintain her cover identity under the stress of the mission while processing the political implications of her actions. Unlike her previous targets, General Kadri was not simply a criminal or terrorist, he was a military commander whose elimination would affect the balance of power throughout the region. You need to understand, Dr. Harper explained during one of their sessions, that this mission will likely be your last field operation. Success will establish you as the most effective operative in American history, but it will also make you too valuable and too recognizable to continue working in the field. The weight of that realization settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. For 4 years, her identity had been defined by her role as a sniper and operative. The prospect of retirement from field operations at age 24 was both terrifying and liberating. She would finally have the opportunity to develop normal relationships and perhaps start a family, but she would also be leaving behind the only adult life she had known. 3 weeks before the summit, Sarah began her infiltration of the target country using her cover as a freelance journalist specializing in international relations. Her credentials were perfect, supported by articles she had supposedly written over several years and connections to legitimate media outlets that were unaware of her true identity. The summit location was a luxury resort nestled in alpine mountains, chosen specifically for its isolation and the natural security provided by the surrounding terrain. Sarah arrived early, supposedly to prepare human interest stories about the peace negotiations, but actually to conduct detailed reconnaissance of potential shooting positions and escape routes. Her cover held perfectly during the initial security screening. Sarah's training in false identity maintenance allowed her to interact naturally with other journalists, diplomats, and security personnel while gathering the intelligence she would need for mission success. She established herself as a legitimate member of the international media, even conducting actual interviews that would provide further credibility for her presence. The challenge was identifying suitable positions for the extreme distance shot she would need to make. The resort's security perimeter extended nearly 2 kilometers in all directions, with observation posts and patrol routes that made traditional sniper positions impossible. Sarah realized she would need to establish her shooting position outside the official security zone, in the wilderness area that surrounded the resort. After 5 days of careful reconnaissance, Sarah identified her position, a rocky outcropping 1,647 meters from the resort's main conference building, accessible only by a difficult climb through terrain that security forces would consider impassable. The position would provide a clear view of the balcony where intelligence indicated General Qadri would appear for a brief photo opportunity during the summit's opening ceremony. The night before the summit began, Sarah received final confirmation that her target would attend as scheduled. She spent the evening in her hotel room, cleaning her equipment and mentally rehearsing the mission sequence one final time. Everything depended on precise timing and flawless execution. She would have perhaps 30 seconds to identify her target, calculate the shot, and fire before the opportunity disappeared forever. At 4 in the morning on the day of the summit, Sarah began her movement toward the shooting position. She carried her rifle broken down into components that appeared to be photography equipment, while her actual cameras provided additional cover for her presence in the wilderness area. The climb to her position took nearly 4 hours through treacherous terrain that tested every aspect of her physical conditioning. By 8 in the morning, Sarah was in position with her rifle assembled and zeroed for the extreme distance shot she would need to make. Through her scope, she could see the resort complex clearly, with security teams conducting their final sweeps and media personnel preparing for the day's events. Her target was somewhere in that collection of buildings, protected by layers of security but ultimately vulnerable to a sufficiently skilled marksman. The opening ceremony began at 10 o'clock with speeches and formal presentations that were broadcast internationally. Sarah watched through her scope as various dignitaries took the stage, knowing that General Qadri would appear at approximately 10:30 for the photo opportunity that would provide her only chance for a successful shot. As the ceremony progressed, Sarah became aware of increased activity in her general area. Security teams were conducting wider sweeps than intelligence had indicated, and she could see helicopter patrols that hadn't been part of the original security plan. For a moment, she wondered if her presence had been detected, but the patrols continued past her position without indicating awareness of her presence. At 10:27, movement on the resort's main balcony caught her attention. Through her scope, she could see several figures emerging from the building, including one man whose appearance matched her target profile. Sarah's heart rate increased as she confirmed that General Qadri was indeed present and moving toward the position where intelligence had indicated he would appear. The shot parameters were at the very edge of what was technically possible. At 1,647 meters, Sarah was operating beyond the effective range of most sniper systems, requiring her to compensate for significant bullet drop, wind drift, and atmospheric effects. She had one bullet to cover a distance that would take nearly 3 seconds to traverse, during which any movement by her target would result in a miss. Sarah settled into her final firing position, controlling her breathing and focusing on the crosshairs in her scope. Through the magnified optics, she could see General Qadri clearly as he moved to the center of the balcony for the photo opportunity. He was surrounded by bodyguards and other officials, but, for a brief moment, he would be isolated enough for a clear shot. As Sarah began her final trigger squeeze, something unexpected happened. General Qadri paused in his movement and appeared to look directly toward her position. For an instant, their eyes seemed to meet across the impossible distance, and Sarah realized that her target was aware of her presence. But, instead of seeking cover, he stood motionless, as if accepting what was about to happen. Sarah fired with the same steady pressure she had used hundreds of times before, but this shot felt different. The bullet's flight time at that distance was an eternity during which the world seemed suspended in anticipation. When the impact came, General Qadri collapsed immediately, struck by a bullet that had traveled over a mile to reach its target with surgical precision. The aftermath was chaos. Security teams flooded the balcony while helicopter patrols began searching the surrounding mountains for the shooter. Sarah quickly disassembled her rifle and began her carefully planned withdrawal, knowing that she had perhaps 20 minutes before the search expanded to include her escape route. But, as she moved through the wilderness toward her extraction point, Sarah encountered something that would change her life forever. A small unit of American Special Operations soldiers was moving through the same area, apparently conducting their own classified mission related to the summit. The unit was led by a Navy SEAL commander whose bearing and professionalism were immediately evident. When the soldiers detected Sarah's presence, their initial reaction was to treat her as a potential threat. But, as she identified herself using coded phrases that proved her official status, their attitude shifted to professional curiosity. It was unusual to encounter another American operative in such a remote location, especially one whose mission parameters were obviously highly classified. The SEAL commander, whose name badge read Morrison, studied Sarah carefully as she explained her presence in general terms. She could see him processing the implications of her equipment, her location, and the timing of her appearance in relation to the events at the resort. As an experienced special operations officer, he understood exactly what had just occurred. "Ma'am," Commander Morrison said finally, "I don't know who you are or what unit you're with, but I know professional work when I see it." He paused, seeming to make a decision that went against standard protocols. "Whatever you just accomplished back there, it took skills that deserve recognition." What happened next would become the defining moment of Sarah's military career. Commander Morrison, despite having no knowledge of her rank, unit, or even her name, rendered a crisp military salute that acknowledged not her position in the chain of command, but her achievement as a warrior. It was a gesture of respect from one professional to another, transcending the usual boundaries of military protocol. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition. In 4 years of military service, she had received commendations, promotions, and acknowledgments from superior officers, but none had carried the weight of this spontaneous salute from a combat veteran who understood exactly what she had accomplished. It was validation from someone who knew the cost of precision under pressure and the burden of taking lives in service of larger objectives. "Thank you, Commander," she said quietly, returning his salute with equal precision. Morrison nodded once, then gestured for his team to continue their movement. As they prepared to separate, he turned back to Sarah with a final observation. "Whatever your mission was, ma'am, you've just changed the course of events in this entire region. I hope the people making those decisions understand what they're asking of soldiers like you." After the SEAL team disappeared into the forest, Sarah continued toward her extraction point with Morrison's words echoing in her mind. For the first time since joining the military, someone had acknowledged not just her technical skills but the moral weight of her responsibilities. The moment of recognition had come from an unexpected source, but it carried more meaning than any official commendation she had ever received. The extraction went smoothly, with Sarah reaching her pickup point precisely on schedule. As the helicopter lifted off and headed toward friendly territory, she watched the mountain resort disappear below, knowing that she was leaving behind more than just another completed mission. The events of the day had marked the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of something entirely different. The mission debriefing revealed the full scope of what Sarah had accomplished. General Qadri's death had prevented the coordinated attacks he had been planning, potentially saving hundreds of lives and preserving the peace negotiations that represented the best hope for stability in the region. Intelligence analysts estimated that his elimination had set back insurgent operations by at least 2 years and had eliminated the strategic leadership that had made their recent successes possible. But the political implications were equally significant. By eliminating Qadri during the peace summit, Sarah had sent a message to other insurgent leaders that there was nowhere safe from American reach. The psychological impact of such a demonstration of capability would affect enemy decision-making for years to come, making other leaders more cautious and less willing to take the risks necessary for large-scale operations. Colonel Stone delivered the news that Sarah had been expecting. "This was your last field mission, Sergeant Martinez. Your success has made you too valuable and too recognizable to continue operating in hostile territory. We're transitioning you to a training and advisory role, where your experience can be used to develop the next generation of special operations personnel." The transition from active operations to a training role was more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. After years of high-stakes missions where her decisions affected life and death, the routine of classroom instruction and range supervision felt mundane and unsatisfying. She struggled with the knowledge that other operatives were conducting missions similar to those that had defined her military career while she was relegated to teaching basic marksmanship to new recruits. But, gradually, Sarah began to understand the importance of her new role. The skills and experience she had gained during 4 years of special operations were too valuable to risk in continued field operations. By training others, she could multiply her impact far beyond what any individual mission could accomplish. Each student she taught would carry her lessons into combat situations where that knowledge might save lives or ensure mission success. Her reputation within the military community continued to grow, though most of the details remained classified. Stories about the mysterious female sniper who had eliminated high-value targets across multiple theaters of operation became the stuff of legend among special operations personnel. The fact that she had no official rank or public recognition only added to the mystique that surrounded her achievements. 6 months after her final mission, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the training facility where she was now stationed. Commander Morrison had tracked her down through channels that he refused to explain, apparently motivated by curiosity about the operative he had encountered in the mountains. Their conversation would provide Sarah with perspective on her military service that she hadn't been able to achieve on her own. "I've been in special operations for 15 years, Morrison said as they sat in the facility's recreation center. "I've worked with some of the most elite units in the military, and I've seen soldiers do things that most people would consider impossible. But what you accomplished that day in the mountains was something different. It wasn't just the technical skill, it was the complete professionalism under circumstances that would break most people." Morrison had done his own research into the aftermath of that day's events, learning enough to understand the strategic significance of the mission Sarah had completed. He understood that she had prevented a catastrophe that could have derailed years of diplomatic work and cost hundreds of lives. More importantly, he understood the personal cost of carrying such responsibility. "The reason I looked you up," he continued, "is that I wanted to tell you something that nobody else probably will. What you've done matters. Not just the missions you've completed, but the example you've set for everyone who comes after you. You've proven that excellence has nothing to do with gender, background, or expectations. It's about dedication, skill, and the courage to do what's necessary when everything is on the line." Their conversation led to an ongoing friendship that provided Sarah with connections to the broader special operations community she had served but never really been part of. Through Morrison, she met other operators who had heard stories about her achievements and wanted to understand how someone so young had accomplished so much in such a short time. The recognition was gratifying, but Sarah found herself increasingly focused on the future rather than the past. Her role as an instructor allowed her to identify and develop exceptional students who might follow similar career paths. She began developing training programs specifically designed to prepare operators for the psychological and technical challenges of extreme distance precision shooting and solo operations in hostile territory. Among her students was a young soldier named Jennifer Chen, whose background and aptitude reminded Sarah of herself 4 years earlier. Chen was a small-town girl from Oregon who had joined the military to serve her country and had demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills during basic training. Sarah saw in Chen the potential to become something special, if properly guided and challenged. "The hardest part isn't learning to shoot," Sarah told Chen during one of their individual training sessions. "It's learning to live with the consequences of being really good at it. Every skill you develop will lead to more challenging missions, more dangerous situations, and more responsibility than most people your age should have to carry. Sarah's mentorship of Chen and other exceptional students became her way of ensuring that her experience and knowledge would continue to serve her country long after her own operational career had ended. She developed training curricula that incorporated lessons learned from her own missions, teaching students not just how to shoot accurately but how to think strategically and maintain their humanity under extreme pressure. The transformation from operator to instructor also allowed Sarah to rebuild relationships with her family that had been strained by years of classified operations. She was able to call her parents regularly without worrying about operational security, and she even managed to visit home for the first time in 3 years. The reunion was emotional for everyone involved, as her family struggled to reconcile the young woman who had left Montana with the seasoned professional who had returned. Her father, the Vietnam veteran who had first taught her to shoot, understood better than anyone the changes that military service had created in his daughter. "You're different," he observed during one of their conversations. "Harder in some ways, but also more thoughtful. You've seen things that changed you, but you haven't let them destroy who you are at heart." Sarah's brother Jake had completed his own deployment and was struggling with his own readjustment to civilian life. Their shared experiences created a bond that helped both siblings process what they had experienced during their military service. Jake's perspective on conventional infantry operations provided Sarah with insights into how her missions had affected ordinary soldiers who benefited from the elimination of high-value targets. "I never knew who was responsible," Jake told her during one of their conversations, "but there were times when major threats just disappeared. Suddenly, the roads we traveled became safer, or attacks that intelligence predicted never materialized. I always wondered who was out there making those things happen." As Sarah settled into her new role, she received official recognition for her service that had been impossible during her operational career. She was promoted to staff sergeant and awarded several commendations that acknowledged her contributions without revealing specific details about her missions. The award ceremony was small and private, attended only by personnel with appropriate security clearances, but it provided formal recognition of achievements that had previously existed only in classified files. Colonel Stone, who had guided Sarah's development throughout her operational career, offered her final assessment during the award ceremony. "Staff Sergeant Martinez represents the very best of what military service can produce. She has demonstrated that excellence knows no boundaries and that dedication to mission accomplishment can achieve results that most people would consider impossible. Her legacy will be measured not just in the targets she eliminated or the threats she neutralized, but in the students she trains and the example she sets for future generations of warriors." The ceremony concluded with a reception where Sarah was able to meet senior military leaders who had been aware of her achievements but had never had the opportunity to express their appreciation personally. The conversations provided her with perspective on how her individual missions had contributed to larger strategic objectives and how her success had influenced military planning and operations throughout the region. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Commander Morrison had arranged for several of his SEAL teammates to attend the ceremony, soldiers whose lives had been made safer by Sarah's elimination of threats they had never been aware of. Their presence represented acknowledgement from the broader special operations community that Sarah had earned her place among the elite warriors who formed America's invisible shield against its enemies. As the reception wound down, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from a small Montana hunting ground to the pinnacle of military special operations. She had achieved more in 4 years than most soldiers accomplished in entire careers, but the cost had been enormous. She had sacrificed normal relationships, faced constant danger, and carried burdens that few people could understand. Yet as she looked around the room at the faces of people who understood what she had accomplished, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had been missing throughout her operational career. The recognition she had received was not about personal glory but about acknowledgement of service that had genuinely mattered. The mission she had completed had saved lives, prevented disasters, and contributed to the security of people who would never know her name. The girl from Montana who had learned to hunt deer to help feed her family had evolved into something far more significant, a warrior whose precision and dedication had changed the course of events in critical moments when failure was not an option. Sarah Martinez had become a legend in the truest sense, someone whose achievements would inspire and guide future generations of soldiers who would face similar challenges in defense of freedom. As she prepared to leave the ceremony and return to her duties as an instructor, Sarah made a silent promise to the students she would train and mentor. She would ensure that they understood not just the technical aspects of their profession but also the moral responsibilities that came with the power to take life from great distances. She would teach them to be warriors who could strike with deadly precision but who never lost sight of their humanity. The salute from Commander Morrison in those distant mountains had represented more than professional recognition. It had acknowledged her transformation from a young woman with exceptional shooting skills into a complete soldier who could be trusted with the most critical missions her country faced. That moment of recognition had validated not just her technical abilities but her character and dedication to service above self. Now, as Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez began the next phase of her military career, she carried with her the knowledge that her service had made a difference in ways that extended far beyond any individual mission. She had proven that excellence in military service was not limited by gender, background, or expectations. It was only limited by an individual's willingness to pay the price that such excellence demanded. The story of the female sniper who earned a salute from a SEAL commander would become part of military legend, inspiring future generations of soldiers to pursue their own paths to excellence. But, for Sarah herself, the most important part of her story was still being written in the classrooms and training ranges where she was developing the warriors who would carry on the mission of protecting American interests around the world. Her legacy would ultimately be measured not in the number of targets she had eliminated or the strategic objectives she had achieved, but in the soldiers she trained and the standards she set for what was possible when skill, dedication, and courage combined in service of something greater than oneself. The girl from Montana had become a force for good in a dangerous world, and her influence would continue long after her own name faded from memory.